They are wonderful. We are proud and inspired. So what we want to do now is take some time to spend a little bit of time on EEG. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to show you a demo, and Daniel's going to lead the demo of putting on the electrodes that are used in the sleep lab.
Tanda EEG lesi loren jeche te loni te kanzan gola kanda se garguyo me te pitsunch dus tengres.
Some of you have been very involved in this. Some of you have not been very involved in the sleep lab, so we want to make sure everybody gets a chance to see the application of the electrodes and get a sense of what the experience is like.
Da chesuna ne khachi bana dandanga so malam taxe chi ati kolayan jusichi de tantinga chashi apolan yores khashim bana chashi la yo mareti nitanti kanda da uchi mente hagu yo mares nistambalaya dandanga su kari tandi pichun di tembal tandi chamalaya ane lesi go loren jechi ti kanda special tango yo metan de gi jeli tan lika chisiti kanda da uchi mente ngutachi ayins.
During this, Ken and I are going to describe some terms that you may hear about as you're doing the EEG study, like impedance or ground or reference, and we're going to describe what those terms are for you so that they're very clear.
Danda de kasem bana danda gi EEG gi lo ti pechetan be kasem bana gi khala tangara gi bana danda de tan dreve gi ani kasugure da chi chidinda chike chambu ta ku de tan dreve gi chikha chi pechetan gres da de ta kari me de region de chigins.
And then after this session, I've prepared a talk, I may or may not get through it all, where I want to describe for you the differences between the Muse system and an EEG cap.
Ngarangi digi jela ya tanda de ten samno jela ya ni tamshi chita du chius tamshi ti na la ya su te nga su karsa EEG caps na gula koya gi tanda lesi lor la ya te ta ani Muse search do gula koya chi orwa o ten che gi cheper kari te gi ani tamshi chita du chius imana chichina ya disu tembe chichina chando kor chichina ya cha khabu chando kores.
And then finally, I want to introduce to you the idea that in addition to studying the brain at rest while a person's sleeping or meditating, there's also a whole field of cognitive neuroscience that studies the brain in response to tasks and stimuli.
Danda de la ya shenda chi da ti thamatela kari ngutro chigin sena danda wansa chen kana ne nga suge karsugre malam tan dina do ta cha maim ba ta tili de bala ya nga suge karsugre lepa la ya taksi chegi ko ge dinsin shi chembu chi ores ta tige na ne nga sula ya chi lika chi te pai na lepa na kana do chi chi do ya kuchin chi lepa na lepa ge ya kana do chi chi do la so pa te ta la ya ne taksi chegi ko dekha chembu din yores.
And I'm going to give you a brief introduction to that idea and concepts if we have time.
Na ta ke tenga chu chomba imbai na tanda desi ji sha ju ge ani chi do ta chi ta te ko la yo ngutru chi gis.
Okay, can we can we have Kalden, our volunteer? Yes. Mm-hmm. Thank you for volunteering. Yes. And Ani Tsering is going to help with measuring. Yes, you can take a seat. So yeah, you go ahead and I'll kind of describe as you go. Yeah. Yeah. So we use the 10-20 system to mark where the electrodes will go.
chutang ja chen yushu sa chwa de pe chutang de ta ne long ni ti kon dru ma dru te la ya che ja gres.
So you can see on the slide here, we're marking first the nasin and the inion, so that's the front and the back.
Da da de la ya in chi ge na sin ta in la ni la chwa de in sha te nga su dus ta ba na dan lo de ta le pa gan lo ta ja lo cha shi de res.
And we just use a red wax, so it's able to wash off with water.
Da da de la ya nga su yang la ma ru su ko wa te ra ro chi pe chutang de ta ani dan lo ta ja lo te la ya dus ta ja ge yus ta de ji la ya ko chi sha na ta du res.
By the way, the one in back, the onion, you can feel a bone that sticks out just a little bit at the back of everyone's head. That's the onion.
Jalok ke chashide kar system bala nga so jalok chashide la ya lapa chang bai na de la ya ko do chi jang de yores chama dos tu tu gres o de ko go yores jalo de.
The nasion is the middle part where there's a curve in and out again, right here.
Ta danda de nga so ge na ge gang ge ko ko sampe de la ya nga so na ta kunsam chi do wa kunsam chi kunsam ta ta te na res ta de ma ona khu che de ma chang do wa de la kunsam ti ta na res ku kana ta ra.
So just so you can get a sense of this, this is obviously the front of the head, this is the back of the head.
Ta de ta ba na de pa ka pa ko de ta ba na pa jo san de lo che so sa jab lo res ru ma ta ba na.
And the F, the P, the T, and the O correspond to the main lobes of the brain.
Da de la ya F ju ta P ta ju ta T ju di chama nga su ge le pa ge le she yo ro le she shi shi yo ro ke shi le she shi shi yo ro o ti to chong yo res.
Frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, and occipital lobe.
Ta te ta ba nga su ge dun dab che ne chi tang dab che ne kar sa chung dab che ne nan dab tu shi shi.
And central refers to the central portion of the scalp.
Da de la ya si chi sha do wa si de kar song go se na nga su ge ta te to course go tu shi de ta ba na tu ri de ge jima ge cha shin de chong go res.
The numbers correspond to which part of the scalp the electrode is on.
Da de la ya chang ka chon sha ju de ge kar song go se na nga su ge ta le pa ge se ko ro ta go ge pa pa de ge gang la ya cha shi kang gi ge gang la ya ani lo ni ti tak go yo me ti chong go res.
Odd numbers are always on the left, even numbers are always on the right.
Da de la ya nga su ge you said
Odd is on the left. Yeah.
De la ya nga su ge di do wa cha chang ta ya chang do wa ya chang yin ba na yon sho cha ka ti ba na yon sho sa che ani cha chang yin ba na yi sho cha la res.
So this is the left side of the head, so it's F7.
Da de ta ba yin ba na de ta ka pa ko de na yon sho cha wa yon sho cha la ya de la tang bo de F dun si chi do wa.
And its corresponding electrode on the right side of the head would be F8.
Ta de ro de jo cha la yo chu de yon sho cha ge de F7 do wa ne de ge pha jo cha la yo chu de F8 cha gres FJ cha gres.
Similarly, T3 is here on the left side of the head.
Ta de la ya ti sim chi sha ju de la pa kar sa nga su ge le pan dus ta ba na yon sho cha la do wa.
And its corresponding electrode on the right side of the head would be what? T4.
Ta
What's that?
ta yon sho ta pha jo cha ta ba yin ba na T4 is.
Yep.
And so follow
T3,
the line.
T4.
Yeah.
T3, P4. Ken, any thoughts, things you want to say? Yeah. So the Z is on the midline, and many of you are interested in midline frontal theta, which often involves FZ, which is basically kind of a medial frontal electrode right here.
Ta de la ya yan de ko ge na la ya yok ge yi chun chun de zi in sa sto wa de ge ni kar su gre da
So 10% in between.
ka pe se gora go ri de ge ki ma de chong go res
Six.
ne che su ge ba na
So
ya
three
ma
on
po
each
chi da
side.
nga su ge ki ma ta ne den de ge ki ma chi gora wa de la ya ma po chi ge de la kar su gre tu na ta de la ne chi shin do chi ge dus.
Now, while these electrodes are placed on the scalp over lobes of the brain,
다 단다 ngazuge karsugureta de le pagin deman de ta gangla ngasugeta de te tang gu gi pawati or wati gangla ya ne logni de ta tawi kapsa.
We need to be careful about inferring that the activity we measure at that particular electrode actually comes from that region of the brain.
Ta de kapsa yang ngasuge kari sabja chigure system balaya ane karsugureta logni taksha ju te gi kurang choria te lepa gi chashi te li chongwi gi karsugureta chi jegurindu se chigorwa tinadu samlo tanga ti gi thela ngasu sabja chigures.
And we talked about this last year in our MRI methods or in our neuroscience methods course, that each method has their pros and their cons.
Ta nani lola ngasuge wansa senrkna neta MR ta tinadu kola keche shans tambalaya ane ko thablam re laya ane khola ya yang zangcha ta choncha yores.
The pro of EEG is it measures electrical activity in the brain, so it can measure things very fast, and you know the signal you're studying because you're getting electrical activity from the brain.
Ta tanda de kasanga chu let's loader te ge khola ya ginsen kar yores system balaya ku nga chu lepi nangla yopi ge ne lok ke lokda ti chenje ko yores lokda ti chenje ko yochang lepa ge nangla ya ane ku changu chung system bala ti tang de ge lokda ti jobo khron chenje ko yores.
A limitation of EEG is that we don't know for certain where that signal is coming from. And why might that be the case?
Ta tanda de la ya ngasuge let's loader ge jechi de peche tang pa bana khola ya chi chuncha sna cheka rangshin kar yores system bala ya lokda chi chenje ge yorda im bana lokda ti gawane yong gu yome te ngiten jet ko yo mares ngiten gani ani shet ko yo mares ani ti shema thpi ge jinsen kar yam ban de shagres.
Yeah.
The reason is because the skull makes it, the electrical signals from the brain have to go through the skull.
Good job.
And they don't always go through the skull right below where the brain is. They often sometimes get warped and go through other parts of the skull. So we have to be careful about inferring where that signal is coming from in the brain.
Ta ti karchini ko karsugre gawane yomen ti teng ke mthia ge jinsen te kar system bala ya lokda ti lepin ani ya yonu jela ya ani ngasu ge te gogi ruparwa so ge gogi rupati jude to yongu yorwa ya jugu yorwa te justam bala ya khashichi khatu jit kore khashichi pe ko khashijum khatko juma te jide te ne ko sho phatsula dwetina yores tins bala ya ani di kas cheje pe kapserwa lechi logri ge cheje pe kas ani di de tasayo ani logda din dwani yore se ge tinda do ngasu ge jipa chiati kapsa ani jipa chitan tela ya zabza chi gu yores.
Yeah, you could, one fun. If you were going to want to look at where in the brain the signal's coming from, you could use fMRI, which we've talked about, or intracranial EEG.
Tanda de kas tanda de ngaso lepi na ne logda te yongu yo pa na logda te lepi chashi kangi chini yongu du se ti ta tani tu pa na ngaso ge de fMRI ta. What is the other one? EEG
Intracranial.
Intracranial EEG search or is tanga so leping na lo la ta EEG to wa te ta ane jeli de preparation ta ba na tat Chris.
So at some hospitals, there are doctors that treat patients with epilepsy, and they fail to help them with medications, so they put electrodes inside the head, and EEG can be recorded from those electrodes.
Ta kasa menkang khashik na karchi gore sena epilepsy sena jezer ta insa samsara nga so ta jezer gi nasa ti chong de te ani ko kasa ta ko menchi chi te de takche ma chong bai na takche chong ma thu bai ba na ta member khashi karchi gore se sta balaya nga su logni te lepi nang la ma chu gres lepi logni te lepi nang ma chu de te ani lopi nang la yo lepi nang la yo pe ge ne logda tin du se je ba chi gres.
And just to be clear, the surgeon puts in the electrodes to try to help the patient. It's not for research, but because the electrodes are there to help the surgeon decide how he can or she can treat the patient, research can be done in addition while the electrodes are present.
다 단단히 값을 그 랩핑 나라야 로니 측세 디 값을 당부디 그 다시 시야디 그 무기 수디 마리스 당부디 가르세나 멤버티게 로니 디 파츠게디 다 네파티 다시 시야라 탑시까지 땅 두세 당부디 타고 요레스와 네 그거 삭시 시야라 탑시까지 두테 타고 요레스 다 틴스탄 발라야 골라야 로니 디 측세 요레스 랩핑 나라와 다 체자 랩핑 나라야 로니 디 측비 값을 아니 그 아니 쇼라야 아니 디탄 데비게 그 심지 카치야 듯게 요레스.
And lastly, even with the electrodes inside the head, it's still a little difficult to find out exactly where the currents are arising because currents are flowing all through the brain, and it's possible, but it's also challenging.
다 단단히 값을 내든지 가셔고래서나 랩핑 나라야 로니티 주샤요 빠임바나 디 값이야 지금 로다티 용산 디레세 때 셰페 카부샤 그레스 가르실라 바이나 랩핑 나라야 땅 수고 로진세나 로코다테 가서 거라인 루루바데 그 여자 네 코칭 도안일 헤레세 때 셰 카부치 그레스.
So, is it time to check in with Daniel and his team to describe what they've been doing? They've
Sure.
done the measuring, and Daniel, do you want to take it?
Yes. So now we're cleaning the head first to remove any skin or debris on the scalp, which will increase the impedance.
다 단단히 값을 가르치기 위해서는 당보들아야 체제 차바인스 체제 차누고 제라다 가르치기 위해서는 단디 차라야 아니 고포간라 요페게 지다 가르쳐 그래다 데 다지 폭파당 지금 조그르게 마치기 위해서 데 바이나 고게 체제 데라야 가르쳐 그래다 제 야부제트가 팽기 정로와 단단히 상황을 위해서.
Then we use some electrode paste, which allows the electrical current to travel between the electrode and the scalp.
다 단단히 가서 아니 양고 로니기 페이스라나 당아 쪽에 가서 그래 바바치도 같이 강라 키야치오레티 지게 요스타티 제데데 가르치고 그래서나 아니 된 고파 당아 로니니가 바로라야 로진티 주에 체트 아니 강라
They're on
주에
the
체트
table
주에스.
over there. And then finally we use tape to secure the electrode.
다 되게 제라야 자쇼 페셔 당데 다네 로니티 네 고파 강라 제샤기스.
Oops, sorry.
So just a point here, if you're doing EEG research, you might hear of terms like impedance, right? So when we work with EEG, you got to get the impedance below, say, 20 ohms.
Where's the impedance?
I'll describe it.
다 단단히 가서와 단단히 레스가 로르던 디라도게 다시 집에 값을 아니 지 임피던스에 지금 고용 그래서와 다 임피던스 때 아니 엄니시고 올라래샤세게 지디라도 지 고용 그래서.
An impedance is basically the resistance. So you want to minimize the resistance between the electrode and the scalp.
다 단단히 임피던스에게 인치스게 되게 나온테 파고 바이나 가서게 고시를 고고요레스 고시 단 고시 디 값을 가르쳐 거래서나 가서게 로니데다 아니 레파가 파파로와 고판 차가 파로라야 로다 지비 고시 지거와 디 값을 뇽뇽 동안에 탑시탄 고요레스.
Yeah, let's
So what
One way you
Daniel's
can do
doing
it
is he's cleaning right where the electrode is taped to actually get rid of dead skin cells that add resistance. You scrape those away, and then you put the electrode right on where you clean with that electric gel, which intensifies the current.
다 단다 데라야
No, this is the right.
데네탄
That's
고츠기
the
지게
right.
빠데카레세나 단다 당포 상마조야디 가르치고레세나 가서 고팔 강라야 아니 가서 파파게 타폰다
Just one more
시차와딘다 요파이나 데즈 상마조고 요레스
This is left,
디 상마조 데탄 상마조노 제라야 아니 고양 로다 제라야 펜토노고 코라야 가서 그래다 셔츠도 지기 주야시도가 디 주데탄 되게 제라네 두스지기 요레스다 디게 가르치고레세나 가서 그래다 고게 로다디 주퍼지알라 펜토코레 아니 데라양 고친시 쳔보드니 두즈 사버지기 요레스.
And for those of you who want to go a little bit deeper, you may recall from physics Ohm's law, which is Ohm's law is current is equal to voltage divided by resistance. And so what Daniel's doing here is he's minimizing the resistance to strengthen the current.
다 단다 야체수 지체나 와 ngilkna ngam centkna ne temba sugo yo paina ngam centkna ne ngasu oms temtrim la ta bayamna om ke temtrim kar sakore sena lojinti kangi ta chungre sena ngasu woche te ani goshik go ba tan chungo yorwa goshik go go yorwa ta danda ti che paina goshik ti kasu ke jinyo tong paina ne ngasu phajo de la lojinti chembul he go yores.
So because of their work lowering the impedance and fixing the electrodes, it makes it possible for electricity, very small currents of electricity generated by neurons, to travel through the brain, through the tissues, and through the skull and the skin, and then through the wires to the amplifier.
aloni tingola zugurwa timse tanda ge goshik ti jinchon tongbe kapse nga su lepin na la chombe ge logda chonchon chisgurwa ti ti nga su kale kale lepin na ne yang khore ani karsa nga su ge goge ripa jide tang gori jide ta ya to ani goge pakpa jeli tanda di orwa ani aloni jide tang ani thamadela ya nga su karsa ta lokko yorwa lokko ti jide tang phajogla ya nga su ge tinana lokki dan drugu yo pate ani chlok de gala ya nga su ngun sibares ti kapdela.
Now, when I was a PhD student, we also put on electrodes, one at a time this way, but about 10 years later, there was a development of caps that you can place on, and it speeds it up a lot.
de bernamagul hoptrik jibe kapsin bana ngasu ge tanda cheba nang shin che che logni re rang gola chu de te ani tanda dus takshi chi ge yores imba na ta tinsang ge chala ya ani ngasu tsering yeji chi de te ta tanda kari yores na ani lesi ge logren je la ya khu ge shamu chi yores lesi logre ge shamu chi gore ten gola shaja dus consonant ge yores.
So researchers that use the EEG to study cognition in humans often will use the caps.
ta tanda ngasu dro mig na la ro mig na la ya nginjing thale samlu tang tang de thale ya tashi chini ge tashi shinji pa khusu ge tanda ani lesi logri ge shamu chi gorwa ate ani yang se peche tangres.
And in my lab also, when we're studying a nap, we might use the caps.
Careful not to pull them.
The classic sleep research method is this method because the electrodes have to stay good with low impedance for 8 hours, and this method is often better for that.
ta ngarang ge takshe khang la ya ta bai bai na ani chi nga so ta ni tong khwa chi gorwa ni tong khya gi kapsi bai na ani ta da lesi lor ge shamuti ko de to peju tang ge yes ni bai na yang tanda ge ta dinda do ge takshe chi kapsa nga so ga ni tong malam ta bi kapsi bai na ani tanda nga so ta so jing ge thablan de peju tang ge yes kari chi la bai bai na ani let's go loren jaya ge lorne data ngasu le tang go gala de go kanshla ani ko karsugram goshi tiang ha chu nyonyo gane ni chu jez la ya ni go yores checha de pecho tang bai na ya go yores.
At least it's the standard method that they're using, and I'm wondering, Daniel, do you want to discuss the facial ones that you put on?
Tanda dela ya peche tanga yo pate ta chiga ni ta te takshe chebe ge ani sedengi tablenderes.
So we have several electrodes on the face. You can see we have one on each onto the side of each eye.
ta tanda dusta baina ku ge miki ta miki phajo sojon inshallah ya dus lone de tuyes.
So we'll see later that when he moves his eyes, we'll be able to see the signal move.
Tanda delaten de tanda tigi jela chechu kartongla na kuge migde phatsung go chetang bai baina ne tanda zusha jugo logni te ju de te ane chiga dan jorgo yo pati jela nga chu dus tongres.
So the eye information is very important for looking at sleep stages, and it's also important in waking EEG because the big currents from the eyes are way bigger than the currents from the head. So you can see the eye movements here, and often we want to know here, are we looking at eye activity, eye movement activity, or brain activity? So by measuring both, we can understand.
Ta tanda de ka se chu de ka resena ane tanda mi ki de la sha go de ka resena ane 미긴 구체대 가서게 니게 럼바치다 주어와 니름라 타비 값에 개첨부 차고요 저대다고요 레스트면서 가서게 델타 바이나 고 도니타 바이나 미키 징구치티라야 셰싱그레스 다단당 가서이바나 미키 파주서저당 고라 두스타데테 니 쇼망푸치니다 바이바나 나가 술라에 가서그래 장투당 아니 다티 야고주트 그레스.
Now, if you're using a Muse headband, you get recordings right here, and it's difficult to be sure whether everything you're measuring is coming from the brain, because little eye movements contaminate it. So you're really looking at EEG plus the EOG, electrooculogram.
Yanchesula Karsa Muse and Goquanch to one, Goquanch, the Panagolan to smash Congo, Madis, the Ticaps, Chesula, Lorta Mampo, Damam pushing Jorgo Yoreda, Inayan Ticaps, Nitenchi, de Lesega Loresha, the young Ming Chutan attended to John Vega Loresha said, thank you, Capucha Grace, Karchila Baina, and Asuga de Conte Baina, Ming Chutan attended the young than the Muse taken alaya, dus that in Jorgo.
And Daniel, if you want to go next, there's one electrode here that's only ever used in sleep research on the chin, not in waking studies.
Tatanda dikasim bana dikapsa gansudelaya nikuwa nila toxic pickups ne logni kanchi pechutang chigores tita mani ganja stoa te nik pickups pechutang gores
maybe just have him hold it.
Ni se pickups ge chiga samna tang tang tuzula toxic pickups bana ane te mali ganja de yomares
a chair. Okay. Okay, yeah. Okay, I think we're going to plug him in so we can look at the data.
Dada pa logni data nga su de la ya chen je tigna zugins zuchi de nga su tangtu kandan do tagins.
Okay, then while he's doing that, I'll add in the chin electrode gives us activity of the muscles of the face. And that's important during sleep because one of the things that changes as you fall asleep and get into different stages is the amount of muscle activity as your body becomes relaxed and even at the extreme atonia, which is no muscle.
Okay, let's do these first.
Contraction at all.
Let me get the paper.
Danda dikas manikangla shash to dike chembu chago res karchila paina degi karisong chigi chejagre sena ngachu dongpala yopi ni shadrim ge gushu chigorwa ti chejagre res manikang shapati ge ta karchila paina di karchine ge chembu chago sena ngachu zuputan labat ngoge chiga gushu deta ngachu ga inyegeramba mandwal tenda yang gushu mandra yores 참실라야 참선라야 가르치 그래서나 아니 가서 그래 가서 아니다 페테 아니 페테 쿠바인 바나 참실라야 아니 샤드름라야 쇼네 ku 정금 매바 төл레 차이게 니탄 테나도 주라요레스.
There's even a couple of other recordings that are done in sleep research, sometimes on the leg to see if your legs are moving during sleep, so in a hospital that might be used.
Samsamlaya ane chiga anila taksi chibi kapsa yang aloni tinda do kampak ngaja tinda do yo resta te kapsa chini kubi kapsa kampak na pigi shadun guchetang yo me tinda do se jagores tinda imbaina yang ko menkana ne yang ko pecho atang yo res.
And one other method that we're using that's used in hospitals is to measure respiration so we can see the person and how they're breathing during sleep.
Tanda dela yang asunya pecetang go yopata ane menkana na thosita pecetang go yopage shendachi kare system bala ngachu jimngu ge nambade dus thosichi go restati karlana te anik pickups ngachu uk jwade kana no chinde te tagores.
In a hospital this is important because many people have sleep apnea, which means they momentarily stop breathing during sleep, which can be quite harmful.
Kashichilaya Karioresana, dear Menkana Netangasuga, Ginjumugi, the Karsa Ginjumugi, the Tashichation which are Restarwa, the Samson like Kusukachi system Balaya, and Mikashilaya Koge, Karsa Tuting Tenikangado, the Parachilaya, Nikusona Umata Netantina Chasat in the Yoris, Tistambalaya, the Tradication which are Yoris.
And we use respiration in our sleep experiments not to detect sleep apnea, but because when people are in a lucid dream, they can signal us about what's happening in their dream by sniffing like, and then we can know that they've express something to us with a code, like 2 sniffs means I am doing the task you assigned.
Tanda de kapsa tanda de la nga chu ge karsa de malam ni tak pi kapsa na gona te de nga chu un jing tak pa te nga chu ni years gro ta ni ge chon chat chu tak bi chet mares
We might
de
not need
system
the
bala
rep
ya
right
ke te nga chu de la karsa gerta
Maybe we can have this
malam
go
ta
over
lucid
short.
dream ro ta ta malam da tena do chin ro bai bai na te te chlo la ya da ta ge chet res ta ko ro da ta ya te ani ko namjin ge lele tang ba mai ba che na khu no ni na shui chambu tang de te ne ko chlo la ta se chin la ya ta chi ko ga ni gar ba do la he song se da tang ai che te pe che tang ge res.
So I just want to say a few things. One is, if you're doing EEG research, you may hear of a phrase called the reference.
Ta ta
Yeah, I think we
da
can
de la
just
ya
leave for
tsi
now.
chen da chi de she ja
The wrap is
ta
more
ta
for
de
during
ka
the
se
night,
ne
so
ta da
that it
le
doesn't
si
fall
lo
off.
de
So we can wait to do that.
ta se chi be kap se reference ge tsi te yang chi chu yang si ku res.
And the reference electrode is often back here, behind the ears, right on this bone called the mastoid.
Ta ta da de ge de kap se reference se na ta nga su gu ta khong tuk sa ge se gro ta che sha sa ge wa che sha sa ge lo ni se ji yo res ta de go la yo res na nga su na yo ra na wa ge jaw lo de la pa chi yo res de ga la ja sha res pa
And this reference serves as a baseline because this reference electrode doesn't emit a lot of electrical activity. So when you're studying brain activity on the scalp, this mastoid electrode serves as a baseline. So you do brain minus mastoid to get that kind of relative metric of brain activity.
ta de ga la se na nga su ge ta ji sha sa do ji sha sa wa ta ji tu ke ta da de la ya shi tu ke de sha sa de kari ge de kap se kari chi go se na ani de la ya nga su le pa ge na yo bi ge ko ga lo re te ya yong ko ma re sta pa la ya ani de ta de ji tu la shi sha de ta le pa ga gan la ya lo ne ge na la ya ani ko ge adati kandas jo sha ti ge na ne ani de la ya kandas du se te ten ji de ani nga su la ya ta ko ni cha pensin derbi ga ne nga su le pe na ge ne lo re te ji ge res.
If you're ever running EEG sessions and you're having a really hard time getting any of the channels to work, and there's a lot of noise, your first step should be to pull off and clean the reference electrode. Because if the reference is bad, all your electrodes will be noisy.
Ta ke te chora dida do ge le si lo ri ge ta se chi bi ge kaps ani che la ya ani ke te dida do ge da ti ya go ma chong wa che ani chi kar su re da ti kan jo man jong yong go yo pa na dang pu chi sa te ka re se na nga su si sha sa ge lo ni chi go wa si sha sa ge lo ni te la ya sang ma zo ani te ge ka sa zu sang wa chi go yo res ta si sha sa ge lo ni te ko sang ma me pa ta ko na te le da ta ta chi ya pu yo ma te pa na ne jenda kan sa ya ko ya pu yo ma res.
So you can see at the top left, on the left side, there's a label for each of the channels that we're recording from. It starts with F3, F4, C3, C4.
Da tanda de ge de lorry yong to de phajo sa ta bai bai na ani phajo sa la ya yi ge ta tangka yo chi to F3, F4, C3, C4 se do data ka re system bala nga chu go logni ne ko je te le pa ge gu ga la je sha ju go logni ro shita su su ne yong be ge ne da ti teng yo res.
So the first 6 channels, the first 6 lines going across from left to right are the 6 electrodes on the top of the head. But as Robin pointed out, it's actually a misnomer because we never record from one location. To do a recording, we have to have a circuit. So the electricity goes in off one wire to the amplifier and has to come back and make a circuit. That's the only way we do a recording. So there's always 2. In this case, the second one is the mastered reference.
You second means this one or the top?
It's so the labels are F3 and so on, but it's not really F3. It's F3 to mastoid, F4 to mastoid, because there always needs to be 2.
Tanda de la nga su du sta pa imba phajo te la ya ani F3 to F4 se korang ga lokta te kareng go ba te teng go wa imba la nga su ge delaya chacha yores nga sugarwa chacha yores na chacha yobate kandasres na nga suga login se jala ya login te ko loglam chachang chi trip go yoro re mare na this tambala ya dekapsa ko F3 F4 se shag yore kune yonju tak tak kure res na mare sta de ti nga su kangela ya shisha keshe she go res na F3 te ta tampo nga su shisha sa chiwa otela ya kuran ni shag paro ga ta ko ge chi theng go do wa dus ji de ta ko na ya logda karen go pate nga dus ten yores.
Daniel's still working on it, but we'll see what else he has to add. But just the other thing here is there's a little calibration bar. So this shows how big is 100 microvolts. So you can see this is a wave that's 50 microvolts. You can kind of get an idea of how big the waves are.
Loda ki chichung kana ro chi be te ta yo rest te ba na ko ge phajotele thichi do wa thichin ju sto ga te te ka res system bala ya ani microvolt jag set res.
So if you're ever doing EEG research, another electrode that's really important is called the ground.
Ta tanda ga so le che lore ge taxi chibe kapse te na la ya loni ke chimbu shenda chi res ta te ka la ga sana ground res.
And the ground does a few things, but one of which is it kind of absorbs all the noise in the environment. So it kind of has important noise from the environment.
Ta tanda ground se this chitang ba na ga so lok ke se pa na sala de ya tirwa sala ma thuya ge lo chi wa uto se go ground se na wa tanda de ka se kar chi re se na ani khoi na yong be ge ta chi kar su gre ta chi ke chola so pa mampu chi khurang ge ani ma prezu gre standa ground se dige.
So if you're having messy EEG data, another electrode that you can work to make sure is really good is your ground, because then that's going to affect the quality of all of your data.
Ta tanda yang ke te chela ya let's lore ge tangthu di ya go yong me pa ba na ya shenda chi samaj wa te kare se na nga so ge ground se ta sadre ge logni chi warwa o ti samaj go yores.
Another important point is the amplifier, right? So you have this amplifier, and the amplifier's on the table there.
Ta dina na trip cha shenda chi kare se na ko dati chirta ya ge yuchi chi gorwa cheche ge yuchi chi gorwa o ti resti tanda de la ya roxe kan wala yos.
And
Not too far.
what the amplifier is doing is a few things. One, these brain potentials that we're studying from the scalp are really small. And so we need to amplify them. We need to magnify them in order to make them measurable and meaningful to us.
Ta tanda dege ko dati chirtani cherche ge yuchi tige ko leka mampuchi chige ores ta tina ne chiga res stambala ya ngasu ge lepa ge go ge papa gana yon shajo ge chi log ni ba chi gorwa te hachang chongchong yo res ro ta ti chongchong yo pa te ane ngasu ge chi ka lot ge pa ta shit ka ge cheto ane khu te jashe pa chi go te chirtang ge res.
So once we have once we have all the electrodes on, we do what's called biocalibrations to make sure that all of our channels are recording properly.
Ta tanda ngasu de la go la ya karsa gola let's lore te chama ge chanu ge jela ya tangpote karchi go res stambala ya ne ngasu te la ya ko ge anyum dri ji go yo res ro ko ge che ta digu yo res ta te ge kapsa karchi go res na tanda ngasu ge sha ju ge lone te ta ke ani che ta jege du mudu ko na te le da ta yong gu du mudu te ta go yo res.
So first we say, just relax with your eyes open.
Ta tampo ge karchi ge res na ani mixi de ta ani lolo chi ro chis.
Next, we ask them to close their eyes. And you'll notice that the alpha rhythm becomes more prominent.
Next,
we ask them to look left with just their eyes.
So these two here are the eye channels. One is vertical and one is horizontal. So moving your eyes left and right, gives a big deflection here, vertical other directions, so we can kind of see different directions with these movements. So can you keep your eyes still for a second? Look straight ahead.
Uh-huh.
And so these two lines are kind of flat. Now look left. Now look right. Okay, so we can see those very clearly.
Tata de casa della wala yo chuten chakare sena ngasu meki phasu chojla jesha jo logni tin yom bi gdares ta de chikare sena ka sanga so chi thela che chi chen la ro chi ke thela gu chotang pat chogre chi ke chen la gu chotang te thang chogres tata de tempana singe mi ching gu choma ta chi de ro chi system bala ya ku logda te ya shi chen bu phakomen do ani chi yon la ta ye la ta sena ne ku phajo de thong do.
And we would also ask them to look up and look down.
Tiki jela ya ne ya ta ma ta lagres.
This is laughing, right?
Yes. Yeah, so that's the muscle activity. And so to make sure the EMG is working, we ask them to smile. So you can see how much thicker it is because the muscles are active.
And you can also see that even though these are the two channels called EMG for electromyogram, when he's using his facial muscles, we see it in the eye channels, we see it in the brain channels, because it's high voltage, high amplitude activity.
Shane tang shadim tang rewege adati lanyi tirware bare. Ten sambala yan zim ten ses tambala ya shadim tang rewege logdate chirin ruwa matse ani mukun gocho tang rewe tela yon ko logdan jiran rugduwa. Nanshin gugu tela yan logda tela jiran rugres.
Now, can you close your mouth and tighten your jaw really strongly?
So dus katzim de tang sun dus shichem butzim rochis.
Tighter.
Good.
Okay, and now relax completely. So you can see the difference when he's relaxed the muscles.
Just one thing. So I typically think of this type of EEG as being like the RPMs of a car. It's how active the brain is, right?
RPM?
Active, like repetitions per minute, like how revved up the car is.
Let's look at the chombe to the embina and ngara ne long course ke
Sniffing and the loose.
Kamashkana kurakasu jagdu search gorwa o til dauchile chonguyes sorguyes te junsen karla bana digi kari songre sena ane lepati katsu thupu imeti songuyores.
So you can see right now Calden's brain is pretty active because we don't see a lot of ebbs and flows in the waves, right? His eyes are open and it's pretty active, and this reflects a lot of beta and maybe gamma activity. But Calden, if you could close your eyes and relax just for a moment, and I'd like to give people again another way of visualizing alpha brain activity. So now you can actually see the distance between the peaks. Do you see how they're further apart? Which means his brain is oscillating at less cycles per second. It's slowing down a little bit.
This thole chungu pati tongores that is abana kachari rigna tele ko dinguchia seti chinyon rugo pata ni lab de la tapa bana lab ni ge zig parugo pathate te sian ko tangitante bana chambuyores.
And he has real nice alpha activity, so you can even count those peaks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is a second, so they're 10 cycles per second or 10 hertz. which is the alpha frequency.
다 단다 데 갑세 바나 코게 단다 데게 레사 로르라 타바 바나 가수가 아파게 랩 알랍티 야푸슈 통도스라 나디나 타바 바나 가수가 코게 제치여와 제트준도 스탕가자 두탕가자 바나 쭈두와 쭈티 커세치크나 쭈스고레스 타티스타 발anga 수게 델아야 하츠 쭈스고와 스타발라 데 가세 야푸 통도스.
So the last thing Daniel will check is respiration. This is the airflow, and he'll tell you about that.
다 단다 다 타마테 코게 다티 젠데치 카르타게 시스템 발anga 수 이긴 점거테 타그레스 타텔아야 겐다닐라 그레시자그레스.
So we often ask our lucid dreamers to signal by sniffing. So we have them practice before they go to sleep. So we tell them to do 2 fast sniffs. So it sounds like. Yeah.
단다 데 가서게 지탕위 몰람라야 딱세치하게 체때 아니 고 조식진이들와 아니 마콩어라 콜라 존데 그레스 존데 카르다 바이나 넷게데 초롱라 땅위 몰람 존바이 바나 가슬라 다간다스트리 로체스나 가수게 우테 시쳔불라야 지고라 나가나네 데 타마니란 로체스레 다테 테그레 콜라 두 존데 테그레스.
And so you can see normally when he's breathing, it's much lower here in the airflow. And when he sniffs, we see those up-down signals. And so, yeah.
다 남진 바나 코 르르탕 비캅센 바나 코게 다타테 랍테 남진도 송거도 와다 가수 우통에 대 나가나나 우식첨부터 시스템 발라야 코게 다티 식첨부도 버석도.
Can you speed up your normal breathing rate just a little bit? Just breathe in, out, in, out.
이게 정말 대신 조르탕으로 치다사.
No, not so big.
진조 당사 진조. 어떻게 더?
So he's breathing in and out. Those are the inhalations, exhalations. Now just go back to your normal breathing.
야 강게티 바나 가서 우 템바체 마티 우 레바드레스 단 그냥 콜레지 당로체스 우데.
This is the slow breathing. So in, out takes 4 seconds. Another breath.
다들 헬레지 아드레스 우 응바타 파탄 베캅스 코 카르사스 시드나 고도아.
And I just thought I'd mention it's very cool that even when people are dreaming, if they sniff in their dream, we still see the same signal.
다다가 소게 말람라 딱시집에 가서 네고 땅위 말란 총바인바나 나그나나 고랑 부당로지세 바인바나 데 땅바인바나 또 땅바인바나 가소게 단다 통바난 신기에로 콜라야 쳬브른도와 땡가 소게 통고요레스.
And the way that they tell us when they become lucid is they look left, right, left, right. So 2 times in each direction.
다단다 땅위 말람라 총바이나 고수다 말란 당연히 디스브라 탁시 제사티 가술라 dak understandresena ane mikita yonshola chita yeshola chita yonshola chita yeshola chita dusta thamani tabala tende tanga sula datrek yores.
Yep, so we can see there he just did it, and yeah, perfect. So that's what it looks like for the lucid signal.
Da de tongwe malam chongbain bana tanda mikita tengyo zane da de tembain bana de la ya ngasuge tatin dren rochi chongres.
Yep, so this would be the end of the biocalibrations. And so then we would have them lie down in bed, and we would finish our protocol by playing some sounds and having the sounds go just quiet enough so they can barely hear them.
Da tanda de garesena ngasuge da ngonru girwa da takung gtcha do chi chago res ro tanda chet ge gita tchati tanda de la pana chago res ne tigi jela ya ane ko nyesana nyegi sig de ta ane karsogre da ko tati nyagi chiga la tati chigro ne tambo chigro yang da uchi ta da chi ta tigi jela chinchon ta de ta kale nyagi chig de ta ne te thachete chiang gres.
So one of the things that we would see if Calden was starting to fall asleep is that those alpha waves would become really prominent.
Tate tashe sa gen kaden bana ko ani kupa in bana ro ata ani ku ru ka se bana ngosu to puchi cha kar cha gre se na tang nga su thoi ga alpha ga lap chi do ga alpha lap te ani mount do ata ngosu to du gres.
And you would start to be able to see those peaks between the waves to get further and further apart as his brain slowed down to fall asleep.
ta tanda de kas lor la ta ba na lor ga nang ne ni ku ros tambala ya ane le ping nang gi shangu chinyon du gore chinyon du ta tne de ta alpha ga lab ke ane ko ga dishe to nyon du gore tim se ne lab ta te ko rang du gores.
Wow, this is a beautiful depiction of slowing the brain down.
Ta de ka res tambala ya le pa gi che go te ane chi chita la ta ya ge na pitsen pe ya bu chi re dos.
And then eventually, as Calden went into deep sleep, his brain would even slow further down. But as we know, eventually Calden's brain would cycle back into REM sleep, where a person has really active dreams.
Tata de Kasibana, Kwani Natsugi, Nitupula Kukasimbana, Lepigi, Ani Kasa, Lepigi, T or Wangasuga Lapchi or Lapti, Tili Kurajachi do your rest, the ter do your rest, Nitiki Jela Yani, Natsugi, T Mungan Yimuganichi or T Capsidus Yungres, that on Stabakasimbana, Kula Malamta and Guzgachigorwa, Tengores.
And we have most of our deep sleep earlier in the night and more of our REM sleep during the later night and early mornings, which is why if you're going to study or you're going to observe a sleep session, you often come at 4 or 5 in the morning because that's when a person's having a lot of REM sleep and when there's a likelihood of being lucid.
Tadanda ngazu taksichiwi kapsuro nilamla taksichiwa tantam malamla taksichiwi kasimbana ngatsuga ni thuputi ta chiga Tsering ta chik tola ya jungu yo patang ani danda ani mungge nyimuge nyete ani tsanga meta ani shokpa thurang ka sa sagora ta shokpa ge tsentela ya jungu yo rest tin stambala ya ani namjin bana nga suge tangbi malam la ya thase chigi yo paina chirge na malamti ni mungge nyimuge nyi ka sa malan chongwa ta te ya chi shokpa chi shiba ngawa to la jungu yo tin stambala ya ke te tangbi malam la thase chigi yo paina ani nga su chi mungge nyimuge nyi chongwa gi tikap te la ta paina ani ko mungge ta tangbi malam chongwa gi sachati an chiwa yo res.
Yeah, I think we're done.
Any questions? We want to, seems reasonable to do a question.
동번이 지거나 동번이 거는 그렇죠.
지연마도 여보여서 맞아요. 진짜. 반대디 디글럽 거는 티 동번이 양세지 가르치셨잖아. 남자들 랍 되게 농어게 랩하게 채시 수술이야 아니 14부 하고 말했어요. 때 능게 맞아야 되는 문규를 붙이다 아마 공경이 좀 답지체도 그 답지체와 되게 가르쳐서는 메디게 답지체네 아니 빠뜨뜨도 지르시와 답지체게 에이지도지 되게 다른 성거에서는 배 고조 답지체네 메디베 잠블레 되게 체슈들이샤세지 되게 랍데 아니 간다기 몰라야 고전 선지 정거래 봐 라도 간다지 그랬어 저들
매튜라 지지스 거와 earlier you have mentioned about from EEG signals we cannot pinpoint the source of the signal, and we have seen in the meditation studies like such as Minjir Mbuchi and also Matthew Ricard. We have seen they were in the EEG cap or EEGs, and through the study they are declared to be the happiest man or person on the earth. So how is that determined?
I don't understand the relationship between the first part of the question. We don't know which brain area is involved. And the second part, which is about happiness, doesn't matter where in the brain.
Nichi jinsen koai ta towa ta ni ga paro la yan dewa kari ne hakuma sons karchila ba na chorong ke tambo te la ya ni lepa ke chashi ko ne yon sing mudu sa chi se ke dus ni ba te la ya ane chi ko de chi shure sha de chi shure sa ke chi ke dus te ni ga paro te la ya dewa do kari ba ni thoma sons karchila ba na jibudu chibu mudu sa te ya ko lepa ke chashi ni chi la ra le ge pa ta te na do ma ri ga mudus.
So I'd say a few things. Even though we can't tell where in the brain a certain electrophysiological signal is coming from, there's certain profiles of electrophysiology recorded on the scalp that are associated with positive emotion, happiness and well-being. Yeah, we'll say that.
Tanda de kapsarwa chirgin bana nga suge chi lesa ge lor di chepa imbana lepi ge chashi ko chingni da yong du se te ngiten chi chet ko yo mares imba ina ya nga su de tag la teni chong sha ju ge chang tho te tag la ten de te ani te tak ke ne tang la ten de te ani chang tho te ta ani nga su gar su gre ta chi semnyong imba na semnyong yak pe ge shok ke semnyong tang jo yo chu yorwa picha shana chi chi po ta de che tang chi yorwa lo chag yo pa te tag la so pa ge jo yo pa ge chang tho te nga su du song ke yores.
And another point is that to make a statement that somebody's really happy, you need to combine multiple measurements. So that might include EEG, that might include fMRI, where you can tell where in the brain a signal is coming from, as well as measures of self-report and behavior. And you pool all those together, and then you can say, we're pretty confident this person's a pretty happy person.
Time se tanda nga su me chi ta ko ra discipe ti ko chi pu shu chi re sha sa ti ge tena do chi ke che ti ta chi she yon stambala ya ane nga su ge chi ta she na mam pu chi na chong ve ge temple ti chi nyam ti ki de na she ge yore sta pi sha sha pa na tanda de ka se bana nga su ge le se ge lo je che je de ta she chi ba ta she da nga su ge jelly duper wa fMRI jelly duper pa tang ba ba na ko le pa cha shi ko la ya da yong du ti ha ku tu yo wa tini chong pe ge tang tho mang pu chi nyam te che te ma se ani ko ge su su girl mu ni ge nywa du she ge yang ko na ta she chang yo ro ra ma nga su sam sho de ge ta she che chi wa te che ani te ma se pe ani mi ti ge chi chupa tang sha chu ten tang chi yo ro wa te ta mang pu chi chodom la chi de te ani me te ta mi te chi ku chi re sha se ge te na ro te yang chi chi ke tem bi ma ba mang pu chodom chi chi ge yo pa yang yong du res.
And I can answer the first part of your question better. There are scientists who record EEG on the scalp, many electrodes, and then they use a model based on the shape of the head and information about how electricity would travel, and they infer exactly where some brain activity is coming from.
Tanda de shenda tanda de chorang ke choa ke tang chashi tangpo de la shepa imbana te karsugure jiga tinda do la ya jepak chini ke chari pa tinda yo res pisha shana nga suga le pe gang la ya loni te mampu chi chiga loni mampu chiksha ju ti le ge da chong ju ti samata nga suga dusta loje gang la dusyong ko lab gang la ngu gang la yong ko wa ani ti yong ne ti che la ya ku kar chi gre sena logda te ta shi sha chi ti shi sha ni ba te la ya le pa ko pa chi go wa lopa ke lepa ke chakko chi go wa te la takshe chi ne ti ni ba te chi ro te chi ti gang la ya ani nga su ge lok ti kan da sin ro sa re sa chi go wa lok ti ge jutang te chu nyam te ro chi de te ani dina ro chi ba na ani lok da de do na yong sa re sa ku su ge yang ko je pak ta ge tin de chi ji ge yang chen ru pa yo res.
So you will see papers where EEG data are used to infer, maybe combined with other data from other sources, exactly where the EEG signal is coming from. But there are limitations to that. The weakness is, even though if you have a model and it shows where the electricity is starting from and how it looks on the scalp, the problem we have is you start with the scalp and you want to know where it's coming from, and there are many possible mathematical answers to that. So that makes scientists like me and Robin very skeptical of the approach of those other scientists. So the other scientists may say, it works, our model is good. And we say, I'm not sure your model is good, so I'm going to remain a little cautious.
Very skeptical.
Tanda tinda do kapse imbana yang ko khashich karwa chenrupa na khashich karyo reses tambalaya letsigi lor ge tranthu ta ko chigni mai ba mangpu ni sam ko de te ane khusu tila iship chinya tinda yores tu se iship chi de ta alen dine imbana ne ko ndwani chonsha re sha sa ge jipak chi ya ge chigorwa tezula yang khusu ge yang ko pezu yo pam se yang chi ansig lamni chi drug ga ne ko tala phe ge ni tan tinda do yores imbai na yang ko chi ko te karsu gre da chi Mampu chi la te ane chi ko jepa chi ge ye chang so temsenga suge chiga alepi gi nane chiga logda chingong bana kange yong yo pate alepa kangla kabala kebala tende de ta singme chance de nga ta ni gen robin ta bin bana dita la chiga karsugure zabza chia ta tono chia ro ne chesugi ta da tinda do la tende de te dusre sha se gi jipa chia gi chiga jetap de ta chiga physics da yapures imba na ya asu te la ya chiga ko laglan chi ka su zabza chi gi yes ate nga suge ta tin zing yes.
Are there other questions, Dawa?
Di kandila tombani kama chikosi nijika chikone lol chitan digrelas. Tombani chikamsi niji chikamsi tini chawaya mestan digres.
Can we ask Kandan to meditate on first emptiness and the second compassion to see the difference on the signals or the wave?
This is the final test.
He'll pick one and you can guess which one it is.
Okay, Calden, if you haven't switched to the other one, maybe do that now.
What's the other
Okay, so I'm really glad you asked that question, Gilek. And the reason I'm glad you asked that question is because although we could feel a lot of peace emanating from Calden, it's really hard to look at EEG data in real time and get any insights.
Tanda chong drop pangate go chong tanda deka sembana ji tadi tabaymbana gen la tachiko samti shivani wa gi ne tante yong go reti na shanga sulaya EG ge lesig lor di phatla nga sula tila dustong go res imbai na ya ta kaptila dus tabaymbana dusra ko ge tila gom jabala ten de nga suge phajola shebe ge lesig lor ge lap tila tabaymbana te tola ten de nga sula chikar sa topa sawa chitang na chi hisha sawa chi ragate dus khapu chi res.
So my sense is you didn't see any differences on the screen between the emptiness and the compassion meditation.
Tanda ngarang dusla ya ngarang ko chocho ka so sona ne tanda de ko ge toni tanyaji nisha gombi kapsar wa loglo gombi kapsar de la ya ne chi chepper kari chong pade peche choi ki mares.
In some situations you can see something meaningful on a screen like this, particularly if a person has epilepsy and has various types of seizures.
Yang sam la ya yang tidak do kapse chiga ngonsu to bu thonga tina yong ko resta ngasu la ya jezer yo ra jezer epilepsy ko to tina do yo pa ina ni te kapse khola ya tanga su ge chiga jeran sagam do kar sa te tige ni tan te chong bi kapse ba na yong ko chepresh ku chembu thonga ching ro o te yong res.
Or maybe in Ken's work you can tell that a person's in REM sleep versus, say, deep sleep. Deep sleep versus REM sleep.
Tim sayang shendai bana tanda gen Ken lagi chi takshe khang la ya ani nga so ni tupu kpi kapta ya na mungin ni se chorwa ten ni gi paro ge chaperte ya chi ngonse to bu thwa tin ngres.
But if you want to look at Calden's brain during emptiness meditation versus, say, compassion meditation, we're not going to see a lot just by looking at his brain waves projected on the monitor. We actually need to do some processing of the data offline to determine mathematically how much, say, alpha, beta, theta, delta, gamma activity that Calden has. And that's where we would start to see perhaps differences between compassion and emptiness, not just visually on the screen based on that. So it's a really, really helpful question, Gaelic.
Ani gala ya share deagra karpa gala share deage lab de tala ta bai bana ngosu to puchi thongko mares yimbai na ya tanda nga suge nyangji gomba ta tonyu gomba kapsa lepe na la ya ani chi ta danda del hopper ta lori de la ya chepre do mdo sa ti yimbai na nga suge ta de la ya tangthu drup chi sha ju ti khi de ti ni jalo ni ta de la ya ishi ya puchi chi thu pai bai na ani ti kapsa chepre yo me ti thont kre speech sha na nga suge ta alpha lab gamma beta la sopa mampura la mampura o te takya etuse katsuchidu mono katsuchidu la sopa la ya ishiche paimana koroni parola ya chepakari pate and take up this chichina this chitonto grace.
Just one last point. For those of you who use the Muse, you're aware of James Glazer's program that he wrote. And that's what that program does. It takes data that looks like this and breaks it down so you get these values of the amount of alpha, theta, beta, gamma, etc.
Tatanda shenda chetsu yang Muse special tanya yo bana Muse the James Glazer kurang shajuge traja chu sardo te na la ya dus ke bana and Muse te na ni chon shajuge tanto te ganza and kurang ge ta ishipche and kurang ge ka iseche de te and te ge na la ya lab te tak na la ya alpha beta gamma la sopa ge ne lab te kari kari dum de te khoge dus iseche de te isipchi gres.
So we were going to do another lecture, but we only have 15 minutes. So why don't we just do another couple questions and then we'll be done for the day. So somebody else had a question. Does anyone else have another question?
Loda zigora. Loda jili wade chigi zimni para chayatanji yonggyori yonggo marisi. Tanda daji tonggyora pagana gushak zajuwa. Gushak zajuwa dina zita zimni shira para liya tanji yori yomar. Logzin jo. Tangi logzin zisha songa. Tanji para chanrika chigi tanda jasong nongjo na gushak zakamena para na tangni guyan jo tang. Yang sara yongjo da ziman jo tanji yona mena. Tanji daji zisha songa tangi di da chershi ziyore la song di da to zo ji chimbo zo ya dong chong chong zo ya ji sha song de gan jin jo cha song yang ji cha ta do ji ji go ra ze de la pa ri ku ko ji ji go jo no ka ji go jo da sa wo chang ma sa na chi chi la pa la da dong di kan la ka shi chong chong na chimbo zo ya ji sha song da chershi di yang cha ta da ma song na man ji gan do.
Two questions. First question is when we get the signal out of the brain, we have the data over here. Also, we capture the signal or amplify the signal by the amplifier. Is there any way that we can send back the signals back into the brain? Also, like you have mentioned in the earlier, like that electrode into the brain. And second question is about the amplifier. How does that work? You have mentioned about amplifying to some degree that we can see or we can understand.
I'll take the first, you take the second. How an amplifier works. So the first question is very interesting. Right here, we're doing what's called passive recording of brain activity from Calden's brain.
Tanda tanda chong trati ko nodus tus ro tigna ni tanda dela ya ngatsugi zugu ngatsugi tanda dela chigi opati gen kanten lagi lepagi 지금 법화관에 아니 지금 로다티 지금 랭교 파스고 왔다가 지금 퉁고 지금 옆에 아니 그 자와 지금 레스.
But there are new techniques that you may have heard of called transcranial magnetic stimulation or transcranial direct current stimulation or ultrasound technology, where we could actually send a current into Calden's brain and affect the excitability of the neurons in his brain to increase or decrease brain activity.
단다 dimana 단다 데카서 가서 고가 다테 고 가르던 게 요바테 손코랑 가서 손코 동고 지참 레스 셴바이나 가서 가르워레스나 당기 셰바나 신데고 레파기 나라마 땅데테 아니 가서 레파나 마땅데 니에들 레파나마 땅데 땅아 수가 록 하블나 텐데타야 레파 차시 살롱 치아타 야 로진라 텐데 살롱 치아 지거와 데탈라 텐데타 딘다게 탑시 딘나 요레스 디게 카르치 그레세나 레파난게 왕사 타즈투즈라 살롱 치데테 아니 코게 지 젤리티 만타 동야타 뇽타 지거와 오티게 차와티 지기 그레스.
And these techniques are quite safe, and they have two purposes. One is they're very interesting from a basic science perspective, because we could increase or decrease a person's brain activity and see how that affects their perceptions, their emotions, and their thoughts.
단다 딘다도 치아테 스르게 바나코 딘적레스 노션 딘다 요마레스 아니 셴다 치바나 델라야 코게 카르스그레데 돈드리마스나 얀쳔부 카르스그레다 고야 딘다 동그레스 카르실라바이나 tanga suga lepa nang la ya jiga da tinda do tang wala tin de te ani lepa gi jele disgo lepa gi jegu te mant tong ta nyon tong ta ko yores ti jeba imbaina ani me ti gi jiga suga wan suga de she la so pa ta jiga samnyong la so pa gang la ya shuchen ka te du sa jiga te la tak she jit ko yores.
And the second use of this is for some people who are struggling with depression or other types of mental health struggles. These tools might actually help them feel better because you can up or decrease activity in certain brain areas associated with positive or negative emotion.
다 양 현대 바나 가서 지금 이목라 속박이 섬기 강에 태다나 임바나 단다게 탑시티나 도고 펜토고 요레스 아니 코알레파게 차시시타파 지그나라야 코게 제고티 만다 땅아땅 아니 차시시다파 가실라야 제고 만다 땅와라 텐데데 아니 가서 지 가서 그래다 지 섬노이나 야포땅 두고바땅 제비게 레파게 차시테다 아니 셀론 제바땅 셀론 마치발레 텐데데 아니 지 이목라 속박이 함께 강요니 고수임바나 양치 샘바 법해바다 샘바 소부지에 투에기 아니 델라양 고 뱅교레스.
Do you want to describe an amplifier?
Yeah, but the first question was pretty interesting. So what you're talking about is biofeedback, right? And this method has been around a long time. You can use biofeedback by getting the information, for example, from the EMG and seeing when you're tense. And it could play a high tone and then make a lower tone as you get more relaxed. And you can use that information to help someone relax if they don't know how.
Tadanda de bana delaya chonga tra tamputine pe apudusta de bana ngase dela karsagresena biofeedback sigdwa tanga su chingui tan debege ta doksu se ite sigresta tikar se karsagresena tanda chorang de bana pichasana ngasu shane tan dewe ge tangthu chi de legi oro lab chi ngor lab thongo oro de kapsim bana chi lopi kaps kandaresha drimbi kaps kandaresha ta gorwa ta data ke tangthu de ngasu pechu tang deta mi khashi chi bana ko ge shadram te la chun shu deta lelo chama thga ta yana kama thga ge ne tan tan gorwa data la ya yang ko kum gi ga do ta yana lo gi ga ge ro chang kum chi ga la ya yang pen to ba yang pechu ta yores.
So that's an old style of biofeedback, but a newer style along the lines of what you were saying is it takes the information from the recordings and uses that to perhaps stimulate the brain electrically. And so something called closed loop stimulation is used, where you modify the brain activity with your stimulation, measure the brain activity a moment later, modify again. And so this loop means it can automatically work at changing brain activity, and that's a very recent technique that probably is going to be interesting as it's used.
Jimmy Tokso Talman Masana Nimpachi race. The Niche Saba Churi Sabatica Resena, Tanda Korangalepa Nalaya, Dakanda Uchi Yongudu Tits Le, and the Telaya Chinchita, the Yancheng Atsugalepana Patong de Taya, Lepana Salon Chiachura, or Tus Chiachura, the close loop Lena Asuga along Nambala, Chidusco, Karsugre, Junti Machepachi, the Juntu de Tandruage, Netandinachin, Jungores, Titandagi Talum Savatris.
Now again, the modern amplifier is here, this very small thing, but the old type of amplifiers, when I was a PhD student, took the space of a washing machine and had tubes in them that did the electrical processing in an old style. So amplifiers have been known for a long time.
Jachetagi Yuchich to the Tanda Bana Tanda Gasu Sawati Bana Chinchin was the Garam Baramba Lotu Chibika Simbana and Asu Tulotre Yuchich to a Chich to what Tinda Nazi Chambuchigores, the Tin Ancient Korange Nani Chirtan that Koronga Dati and Kuritiku or Tichiatilaya and Kugu Ngoma in Bana Yuchit has Chambuchigores.
And now with modern electrical circuits, they can engineer that all on a very small board, and it's taking the very small signals through an amplifier circuit that is then able to make a bigger signal of, it starts out as 50 microvolts, and they can turn it into 10 volts and then use that to allow a computer to get the information and then digitize it and store that information in the computer, because this wire coming from the amplifier has to travel several feet, and if it was only with microvolts, that would be gone by the time it gets to the computer.
Nangla yopiga lodati sejabana delanga suga microvolt jardoga microvolt just istambala ya churtkhya tantina do thonthkya chi yomaris tatim bane te jachi chetang de tang khuge jachi gi yuchi chi te ro yuchi te ge jachi de te ane vote chunda uchi ga nambala zu vote chun number chi la zu de tang ane ti ti ane khuna nyer sa che tang da tanda im bana de la ya ko lokko ji de tang hajo dus nga so teng do ga de ji gi yores 다 거기 리가 좋대 그 칠던 거 요랬다. 아주 통통하게 제대 칠던 거 요랬. 다티 게데 텐다로 치 매바임바나 다 마이크로봇 다 잔도치 바이나 로코나 텔레코 테스팅도 바이나 그런 게다 지 준티 첸도 그래서 하좀 총총 인자.
And another modern improvement is the amplifier can be so small that some electrode EEG systems put a little amplifier called a preamplifier right here in the electrode, sometimes called an active electrode, in which case these wires are carrying stronger signals and getting better quality data, though most of those systems aren't so comfortable for people sleeping, so we don't use them.
야 단다 현장 가지고 자식이 유치되와 자식이 유치되 아니 그 현대티나 요레스다 현대티 같이 그랬으나 그 가식이 나네로 야 하청 총총 자식 유치다다 디레스도 딜리 총아된다 요레스 가식이 디 거라샤 그랬으나 가지고 loknindoa lepani ko parola de tampo kro chi karsgure da tishu chambu choela ya pecho tang de te ani dus ko tase chini tena do yore simbana ta nga su de kapse bana ta tena do pecho tang pa na du mesa nga su tase kapse tigir de pecho tang mes.
So we'd like to thank Calden for being our participant this afternoon. We'd like to thank Daniel and Topke and Shoyan and Legdinla and everyone else that helped out. And Nicole has something to say about our next exciting step.
Oh yeah, ni chamala tuchena sinte jile gen Nicole again ni jila karichigo me coach songres.
So tomorrow morning we're going to do an experiment all together measuring chemicals and bacteria in water.
다 산지 쇼파나 가서 참하게 냠도 아니 탁시지지게 인스타 탁시티 가리 시스템 발라야 아니 추근나라야 아니 제다 심부여와 심부카리오 메티콜라 탁시지게 인스
And that's because in terms of physical well-being, access to clean water is one of the most important things that you can do to reduce human suffering.
다 디카르치스 삼발라야 나츠 미게 데탕 스고라다 트로텐탕 데탕 그때나네 게 치시치카레스 삼발라야 통추 정말 유메들이스와 디스tambalaya 아니 데이터라텐데데 아니 추 통추 정말지 라발라텐데데 다 추르지에 발라텐데데 나츠 드로미게 야치 강에 망부치가 텔라텐데 세트크레스.
So we are hoping that a few of you who live near here might be able to go get us some water samples this evening that we could use tomorrow morning.
다 가서 가지고 지고 세나 데라야 데니 라티게 이연라 데니 아니 가시 지도 이연라 친데데 아니 추기 비천 가시 지도 지 키용야 되는 건다 선지 키용야라 야리와 지기 예스 내가 수 산이 쇼바네 키용 주고 비천데 아니 딱시나 베쳤던 게 예스.
And in particular, if you can think of a place where you can go get water, where you likely get chemicals from agriculture or farming, that would be interesting. Or if it is water that you know people drink from and you're worried that is contaminated or dirty, that would be interesting. Any kind of water that you think might be interesting to test. We'll get water from our taps and things.
다 되게 유연라야 다 통치여 발레 디다 통치에 연바나야 데 탁세도 지진이도 정말 이남나 사미아티나도 치여 바이나 직제 통치르와 데 직제 다 니바데 가레스 스탄발라야 나츠고 다 되게 유연라야 신가 마보여와 다 신가니 치슈르도사게 양티나도 여와 디나나나야 추나나야 진담나도 진디요나마나 신가니 마용치로와 디나도 양 지가 되게 양 비천도 랜사요나 디나도 키용로치스.
So can you raise your hand if you have an idea of where you could go get some water?
Okay.
Okay, I see a few volunteers. Okay, Dondup has just volunteered you. Her suggestion is each group needs to find somebody in their group to go get some potentially contaminated water. So I'll put 3 vials on each table. You'll mark them with your group number, but put the same water in all 3.
There no some chagana tele chipa chichen jiroches go langu opana chipa chichen jiroches.
Good?
Akuta, go say.
Thank you, Dondup.
That's a teacher.
Green vision. Green vision. Other than we're actually converting to laboratory, which is the last one.